Data and statistics are the backbone of the choices governments make, the services citizens receive, and the policies that shape our economies. In this new Paris 21 podcast, Johannes Jutting, development economist and head of Paris 21, speaks with an expert to explore how the fundamental principles of official statistics play out in real life. I'm Rodrigo Ortiz, guiding the conversation from behind the controls. Welcome to Trusting the Numbers, from Principles to Agency.
Welcome back to another episode of the Paris 21 podcast, Trusting the Numbers, from Principles to Agency. Today we will be talking about relevance, impartiality and equal access. Who needs the numbers? I'm so delighted to have with me as our honored guest Sam Annim. He is the director of the African Center for Statistics at the Economic Commission of Africa. He is the former Director General of Statistics in Ghana, the former chairperson of Paris 21, and he's a good friend. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Johannes. It's so exciting to be part of this engagement, and I'm really delighted because I'm speaking on a subject matter that has three components and very much interrelated: relevance, impartiality, and equal access. So thank you for having me on this episode.
Fantastic. We directly dive into the topic of today. When you hear the phrase, who needs the numbers, what does it mean to you as a statistician? And what does it mean to you as a citizen?
My understanding of this question has really evolved in the sense that when I decided to transition from the academic world to the public sector, because it was a public sector, my thinking was that who needs the numbers is government. But over time, my orientation has changed, partly because of these fundamental principles of official statistics, in the sense that once you're talking about equal access, then it means you don't have to treat the government differently from the public. Once you're talking about impartiality, then it means that the public needs the data and statistics in as much as the private sector needs it, the civil society needs it, and for that matter, the government. So in terms of who needs the numbers, in my view, it goes beyond the National Statistical Office being a government institution, but rather servicing the needs of different stakeholders, including both students, general public, civil society, international community, and for that matter, the government as well.
This is really interesting. And as you say, I mean, the relevance of the data we are producing has been far beyond our initial thinking about policy making, and you mentioned citizens, private sector. One interesting thought that comes to mind is if we have different stakeholders using our data and interested in our data, trust plays an important role. So trust in data has become actually a global concern. Mm-hmm. From your point of view, what does trust in official statistics look like in practice?
So trust is difficult to measure, you'd agree with me. And how I operationalize it is recognition of the work that you do from the perspective of acceptability. So it isn't like any other thing that we are good at measuring as statisticians, but it's the response that you get in terms of acceptability of the numbers. And it goes beyond the numbers, your whole integrity as a person. So when we talk about trust in data and statistics, is not whether the numbers are accurate or not. It bothers one on the leadership of the National Statistical Office, the entire national statistical system, and more importantly, the coherence between what you do as a National Statistical Office and the different stakeholders that we've talked about. So for instance, if the general public citizen sees you as somebody servicing the needs of only government, then there's an issue of threat with the trust that comes with it. So it has to be very all-encompassing, and I think that is why the framers of the fundamental principles decided to put these three together: relevance, impartiality, and equal access, because that is what ultimately brings the recognition and acceptability of what you, the leader, is, what the institution is, and what your numbers convey.
I have recently been associated to an interesting debate. Let me coin it facts versus feelings, because we were just talking about trust. And let me give you the example of an elderly lady living in, let's say here in the outskirts of Paris. she will read your statistics and which says crime rates have gone significantly down over 30 years. And you can prove this with your statistics. While she feels not the same way. She feels threatened because she may watch media, she goes on social media, and it's just a question maybe also of age and experience. So how do you reconcile this facts versus feelings? What can statisticians do to bridge this gap? Because otherwise people might just not trust in statistics.
So again, I like the phrasing of your question in the sense that there are questions that borders on objectivity, there are questions that borders on subjectivity, and that is why in our frame of doing things, we try to ask an array of questions and more importantly, complement aggregate issues with disaggregated issues. So the first layer of your question is that it could be that from a statistical point of view, the evidence is showing a downward trend. But because this has translated into human behavior, human perceptions, and human feelings, the timing of changes in feelings will be different from the timings of the reduction in a phenomena. So in as much as the statistics are showing a downward trend, it doesn't necessarily mean that automatically we're going to see changes in feelings as well. So that is one layer of the conversation. Then the other layer of the conversation is to really drill down from the aggregate level and say that at the national level, we've seen a reduction. At the subnational level, we've seen a reduction. But maybe in a very smaller geographical area, that is not the case. So we always have to put statistics in its broader context of coverage, representativity, and things like that so that people get a better understanding of how it works. And thankfully now the evolutions are such that we are getting citizens' voice on what is happening to statistics. That is why we're talking about alternate data sources such as citizen science, which will go to complement the nationally representative surveys that we do.
Very, very interesting. I mean, to some extent, a direct follow-up question. How can national statistical offices in general make data feel more relevant to everyday life and local decision making? I mean, to some extent, you touched upon granularity, you touched upon national versus local. But I mean, what need official statistics and representatives and staff need to do that ordinary citizens can really feel this is relevant? I mean, you recall the conversation we had about inflation rates. There were headline numbers put out, let's say 5% headline number, but people were going to the local market and were finding their daily products raising by 15%, and they say this is not acceptable. So how do you think national statistical offices can adjust to this perceived reality?
So again, national statistical offices should be very open to the different needs of different stakeholders. So I give you a very specific example in the area of inflation, as you've rightly indicated. Inflation simply is arrived at using a basket of goods and services that we assume that they are representative of goods that the general public buy on a regular basis. But you and I would agree with me that this basket might vary from one individual to another. So two things that I did while I was in office was to develop a mechanism where we call the personal inflation calculator, which has nothing to do with the basket of goods that we use in computing the national inflation rate. So what it got citizens to feel is, okay, if generally, for instance, you find rice in the basket and for some reason you are consuming only vegetables or nothing other than proteins, you are not consuming carbohydrates, then you will be able to, based on general price changes, get a sense by which goods and services are changing in the country. The other way you think about it is that national statistical services have assumed that they are the only agencies responsible for putting out numbers that people should be able to relate with. But this is a conversation that with time it is evolving. We need to get to the practice where we have other stakeholders like the academia telling us what the numbers are, like the development partners telling us what the numbers are, while we do not compromise official statistics. The only thing we do there is get different array of stakeholders that are validating or that are helping us reach a convergence in how numbers are supposed to be used, and more importantly, how the general public can relate with the numbers that we have. So when we talk about relatability with the numbers, it's not just a matter of whether you think prices are going up or not, but doing it in a transparent way. And this is one of the hidden attributes of the fundamental principles of official statistics, making sure that whatever you do, right from the conception stage through data collection right up onto its use, is done in a transparent way, by way which other stakeholders can participate in the process. And that is how you build trust and relatability over time.
This seems to suggest that even if we think about the role of national statistical offices in modern public debates, is something very different maybe from 20, 30 years ago, where maybe the statistical office saw himself as the leader, as the only trusted agency. And now, if I understood you correctly, you were saying, wait a second, it's more like a data steward. It's more like a guardian of certain quality standards, but there are many other realities eventually even out there. And this can be sort of taken up by other partners, that's not nothing wrong with that, as long as the core business is preserved. But it's completely fine if there is academia putting data out and if civil society put data out through their lenses. It's just to be this is this fundamental thinking about a data ecosystem with different stakeholders. So I actually like this very much. Can you give me, when you look back at your career, when you were the Director General of the Statistics Office in Ghana and you were heading up the NSO, can you recall a moment when data you produced changed a public debate or a policy decision? Did that ever happen? That you put out a certain data set or you were sharing a number or reflection with a finance minister or planning minister where that has led directly to a change? Can you think of any of those examples?
Quite a number of them, but I'm going to highlight two of such experiences. And one happened at the peak of the COVID, when we had all these supply chain restrictions, and globally we saw inflation soaring up by the day. And I recall in one of the instances when I had to release the inflation figure of about 54%, which was the highest ever in several years, and also the highest across most of the countries on the continent. And it really was a concern at the time of going to put out the number, because as I indicated, it was so unprecedented. So I had to sort of prepare the communication in such a way that it's going to provide further credence to the quality assurance processes and the methodology that we had put out there. So immediately I did that. I got a call from Cabinet indicating the need for me to come and defend why other, especially neighboring Francophone countries, were recording inflation rates under 20, and Ghana was recording an inflation rate in excess of 50%. Because I had anticipated that and I thought through that, I went there prepared with the differences and the historical evidence, and tried to get people to understand simple things like percentage point differences and changes over time and things like that. And even showed it to the point where, in terms of percentage point differences, although there were countries with lower rates of inflation, their percentage changes during the COVID era were much more higher than the percentage changes that we have seen in Ghana. Then the second one that I recall very well and really shaped my thinking as an economist was when we finished with the census, and I realized that we had about 8 million people in Ghana who could not write and read any language, any simple sentence with understanding. And I said to myself that, what is the place of macroeconomics when people are not responsive or would not be able to respond to macroeconomic policies? So I began a campaign on why we should begin to look at macro linkages and social economic linkages to sort of get a rethinking of what it really would take for countries like Ghana, and for that matter, most African countries, to turn around the cyclical fluctuations in development that we've experienced over time. But as I said, there are quite a number of experiences in the 6 years that I was in office as the national statistician.
You mentioned COVID, and I think that has been a fascinating, challenging time for any kind of expert, because I recall that in the hardcore COVID time when there were all the lockdowns. There was a strong emotional debate between those people who say, look, we cannot have people not moving around. This is against humanity. You block them, particularly for children, to be in apartments. And other people were saying just the opposite. It's even you can't put elderly people under risk. They will risk to die. So there were really, really loaded emotional questions. So for me, how can it's statistics at when numbers are very sensitive or contested? Because if you come out with a certain number that leads to either lockdown or not, or those heavy loaded important question, how do you safeguard impartiality when numbers can be sensitive or contested?
I think the fundamental principles, it's very clear and to a very large extent prescriptive on what national statistical offices should do. I wouldn't in any way advise any national statistician to live strictly by the scope of the fundamental principles, but my strong recommendation is for us to build on that. And the reason why I say that is, if we talk about impartiality in the frame of the fundamental principles of official statistics, one of the key things that it talks about is make sure the statistics gets to the public at the same time without anybody, including the president, the prime minister of the country, having access to it. If you oblige with this, and over time people are able to appreciate this practice, is one of the points that you can check off that you are on the path of impartiality. The other thing that it clearly says in terms of the fundamental principles of official statistics is the extent of documentation that you have around the data that you are putting out there. It is not just the number, but you always need to put the numbers in a context, and all of them should be available prior and post. That is why every national statistical offices at the beginning of the year should have a release calendar on its activities over the period, and then after the period make an assessment through a statistical yearbook or whatever to give an account of what is done. And the third part that from my point of view it's very important is national statistical offices are run by human beings, and we are engaging human beings. You need to acknowledge the room of error. So if you have a national statistical office that doesn't have clear guidelines on how to issue out erratas when there are errors, then there is a challenge. So every national statistical office prior to its day-to-day engagement should have publicly accessible guidelines on how to correct numbers that for some reason they put out mistakenly. The reverse is also true, and this is related to one of the fundamental principles, preventing the misuse of statistics. If you don't have a system in place that ensures rebuttals, if you don't have a system in place that deliberately goes out there and say that these numbers that are being put out by these other people are not consistent with what we have, then there is a challenge. And that is why I said the fundamental principles is very clear on steps that we need to put in place to ensure impartiality and equal access. I started by saying that you need to build on this. And this is what at Ghana Statistical Service started doing. We take every policy document and we do what we call a statistical profiling of the policy document. And what we meant by that is we interrogate the numbers in there and ask ourselves whether, one, the numbers are consistent with what we are producing, and two, if they are not, try and get the policymakers to try and get the public to understand what the differences in the numbers are. And we don't even end there. Look at the targets that government has put out there and make a case whether those numbers were really thought through it, given the interventions that they want to institute, and whether they are achievable or not. So really, there is a wide array of options available to national statisticians to constantly evolve to ensure that they are maintaining impartiality and equal access.
You said something interesting, Sam. You just said statistics and official statistical offices need to also be human, and they need to be admitting mistakes, and because they are human, that's today. But we can increasingly see now through artificial intelligence that maybe at some point machines will produce and algorithms will produce the data. So as this is specifically about trust, impartiality, conversation, is AI a curse or a blessing through the lens for trust in statistics? Curse or blessing?
I don't think twice. It's a blessing. And
Right.
I mean, you've not asked me why, but Johannes, it's a blessing in the sense that one, it tells us don't do what you continue to do every day. That's my definition of artificial intelligence. And two, is a blessing because, as you rightly indicated, it minimizes this potential errors that human beings can easily make by building reproducible pipelines that automate what we do. So from my point of view, it's a blessing. Having said that, it comes with its own risk. So one has to be mindful of that. And the fact that it comes with risk doesn't make it a curse. And let's be clear with that. But it is a blessing and we need to onboard it and use it well.
Yeah, I like your optimistic tone because at Paris 21 we would like to be optimistic. And the other day there was actually an interesting article in Le Monde by researchers, by an Indian, sort of Indian Bill Gates, who invested into the ID system and who said, look, I mean, through AI, they have 22 different languages, acknowledged languages in India. And for accessing public services, it's for people who can't speak English, it's sometimes difficult. So through AI, they were for the first time able to access services, banks, insurance, health services. So I think they are quite interesting examples of how AI can even close inequality gaps and have empower people who are otherwise at disadvantage to get them access to services and whatnot.
Johannes, let me quickly chip in this. I think this is something that as a community we've not looked at. Digital literacy is outpacing language and numeracy literacy. And it's something that we all can take a look at because every census tries to capture at least language literacy and digital literacy. And the very minimum is look at the penetration of smartphones. And it tells you that even people who cannot read and write in a simple language sentence with understanding are able to go through the functionalities of every smartphone. So we really need to accept what the status quo is now and see how it can better serve humanity.
Fantastic. I see we are coming more closely to the end of this podcast. I wanted to wrap up our conversation with one question, Sam, related to your new role as the director of the African Center for Statistics in Africa. How will you support African countries in their efforts just not to produce and use more and better data, but also to build stronger trust in institutions? How will you go about that?
It's going to be a balance, and I'm going to be very blunt on this. I'm going to put a lot more weight on changing mindset and systems because, as I indicated right from the conversation, the issue of trust is not about the numbers that you are putting out there. It's not about who you are. It's a combination of the numbers, who you are, and more importantly, the systems. So one of the advocacy issues I'm going to champion as the director for the African Center for Statistics is a conversation around a trust in terms of the entire national statistical system, but more importantly, how the national statistical system interrelates with the governance system, interrelates with the private sector system, and the citizens of the country. Because as I indicated, trust is an issue of recognition, acceptability. It's not what you do, it's what happens over time. So what we need to begin to think about is the enablers of the production and use of statistics. I think we've overly concentrated on what you are producing, how you are using it, rather than the enablers, which in my point of view is the basis for the trust rather than the numbers and the use of the numbers. So that is what I'm going to advocate.
Well, we wish you good luck with that. That sounds fascinating. So, Sam, thank you so much. But before wrapping up this podcast, this specific session was about relevance, impartiality, equal access. Who needs the numbers? And I started off with the question, if you recall, who needs the numbers and your reflection. So I wanted to close asking you to complete the following sentence, if you don't mind. People need the numbers because of
the livelihood transformation that it brings to them.
What a wonderful end. So thanks so much, Sam, for your time. Thanks being with us. And looking forward to continue the conversation. All the best to you in your new position.
Thank you, Johannes, and I look forward to this engagement.